All right. Well, I've got 6:32, so we'll go ahead and get started. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, it is for learning how to be a part of your kingdom that you have called us to be the church. It is for showing justice, for walking humbly before you, that you have called us to seek out and to love our neighbors. And it is for the privilege of being able to declare the goodness of your name that we are also called to seek out those who are lost and who are hurting. Grant that our time and conversation, our study of this book may lead us to ways to seek out those who are desperate for hope and desperate for your grace, which is poured out upon all who ask for it. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. So, make sure I'm on my phone tonight because the irony is I was recording 4 videos today and I absentmindly just left my computer at church. Oh yeah, I got one more video to do tonight. So, or Zoom meeting. So I'll be on my phone, so the picture's a little shaky here. So, thank you all. Sorry for missing last week. The vestry had a very, very good meeting that you'll hear a little bit about in the e-news. But I hated not being with y'all last week. So tonight was chapters 11, 12, and 13. These particularly chapter 12 for me was a particularly hard one on a number of levels, but that's just the way we've done it the last few times. Is I just really, while I have a few things on my mind, I want to open it up for wherever the conversation starts and where it goes here. Anybody have any particular place where they want to start from these chapters tonight? Or Joe has suggested another topic to bring up. I'll just let the evening flow as it does.
Well, I hope everybody read the Oak Ridger this week. It's been quite fascinating to read about the first 85 people who came to the schools, and also some of I think the most recent one was quite fascinating when they described, how they were accepted. Yes, the integration was smooth, but it really, was their actual integration of people becoming friends. And no. So there's a good bit to learn there in that. And I hope if you haven't seen the papers this week, you'll find a way to read them.
And if I can make an advertisement here at the beginning before we run out of time, Women's Interfaith Dialogue on Monday at 11 has Valerie Roberson of Oak Ridge Solutions on Racism talking. If you would like to Zoom in with us, let me know and I can send you the link as soon as it's available. We're still setting that up, but and there should be an article in the paper coming up this week, but you never know. But it's a good group as well. That kind of ties in with so much of what we've been reading. I mean, Oak Ridge is not in the desperate straits that are being portrayed in the book, but still there's some continuing issues.
Mm-hmm.
If it's okay just to launch into something.
Launch on.
The thing that struck me in chapter 11 is the role of the press during the civil rights movement. And lately I've been putting things online just to open up friends' eyes to issues that are contemporary around the United States, but also historical. And the comment I've made is there's so much that's been left out of textbooks. There's so much that was never revealed in our local papers. And so when I read chapter 11, I thought, gosh, yeah, that's right. The 2 local papers in Spokane were run by a very wealthy conservative family. And so they wouldn't put stuff in that they didn't agree with. And so you saw it in work, at work in chapter 11, how the press, now, politicians say, oh, the liberal press. Well, it was quite clear that it wasn't liberal local press. And in fact, the press became a way of creating a public jury and lack of justice for many of the people. So I found that a very interesting aspect, a horrifying aspect of chapter 11.
Well, we see in chapter 11 really the climax of the book when we hear that the hearing that we saw in last week, that they denied it, but ultimately, as the press got involved, particularly 60 Minutes, it turned into a new investigation, which ultimately led to Walter going free. So yeah, this probably 11 was one of my favorite books as we've been waiting all along for what we thought was going to happen with Walter was going to get free.
Has anybody, by any chance, did anybody look up that 60 Minutes interview? Because it's really fascinating, the one that's mentioned in that chapter.
Oh.
If you haven't, just go on YouTube and just type in the search Walter McMillan 60 Minutes. And in fact, before you even finish typing in McMillan, it'll pop up 60 Minutes. And it was helpful because just after reading the book, you get to hear the story, but you also get to see the real characters in the flesh, and just very, very interesting. And Bryan Stevenson, who much younger than when I met him a few years ago, he's a baby face in this interview because I think it's from 1992. But yeah, go back and watch that if you have time. It's fascinating. We're quiet tonight.
Yeah, it's a lasagna. I had lasagna for supper. And I'm sitting here going, oh, I'm still full. It's just pasta. I was just curious to how many people have seen the movie. Speaking of, visual comparisons.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was what do you think of the casting? I mean, as opposed to say, here's Bryan Stevenson's picture, and then here's the actor that played him. So it's just very interesting. Of course, Jamie Foxx, very interesting, really did a really good job there.
Yes, he did. Yeah, really did.
Yeah, I think it's hard because I can't think of another actor that would have worked. I don't know whether anybody else can, but
And the crazy guy who changed his story, he was wonderful. He was utterly amazing. That was a great piece of acting.
I was muted, didn't realize it. I thought the movie was excellent, but I thought there was much more meat in the book.
Oh, yes. Well, there is.
I mean, they focus entirely on McMillan. And there's topics that weren't really addressed in the movie. The treatment of minors was, I find, horrifying.
Well, it's also horrifying. I try to remember which chapters are which, but the situation of the women that have the miscarriages and or have the babies, and bury them and later accused of suffocating, you know, and we've all kind of known this phenomena of the women who kill their children and blame it on somebody else or what. I mean, it's a horrifying situation, but it's still interesting how that they're anyway, he talks about sort of a sensationalism about that, and the fact that there's different laws and legislation out there. And I'm not trying to get into the whole thing about abortion and all the abortion laws, but for women that lose a child, to have somehow be a stillborn child, to somehow be accused of causing that child to be stillborn. You know, I think he made a point that there was just bad pathology to it and very poor situation going on in terms of the medical testimony and things like that. But that frightens me a lot. It does. Because I see a lot of restrictions out there that are almost, you know, almost way overboard, but that's just me. Anyway.
May
Well,
I
he
ask
brings
a
that up,
question?
and I thought that was very good.
Where did you see the movie? How did you access the movie?
You can get it on Netflix.
Netflix?
Yeah.
It's available
Netflix?
free on the at the library, Oak Ridge
Okay.
Library. You can take
Yeah.
it out for free.
It's
Yeah,
free
how
on
about-
Netflix too. I mean, if you've
Okay.
got Netflix, it's free.
Yeah, I have Netflix. I'll
There's
look it up.
several different other places you can get it. The producers decided they wanted everybody to see it after it had been in the theater for a while. And so you could find it a bunch of places.
Okay, thanks.
But it's a really good movie, I think. And you're right, it does focus on just one sort of episode, a key one that seems to really have an influence on the author. I mean, it just really impacted his whole life. And I feel he really got attached to this man and learned a lot from this man and so forth. But it's a very good movie, I think.
Something that is missing, I mean, there's lots missing, but the guard who makes him strip, we never see his, we never see him change the way he changed in the book. And I found that very moving, how he was affected and became a completely different person.
Yeah.
I think it's, to me, I don't see him, the author, I think he was very fair and sensitive to the white consideration, even if it was, you know, the quote unquote other side or perception of the other side. But he really felt a lot of sympathy for this man, you know, who was so much like a number of my relatives, nieces and nephews. But he really had a lot of sympathy for him. And he doesn't look at white people in a pejorative sense, even though he'd have every excuse to. But it was a lot of understanding for them being in the wrong side of the equation, you know, or the imbalance that caused in a moral sense, for them to have so much fear. And I don't know, it's racism, I think, affects the person having, you know, that's from the quote unquote dominant culture or dominant situation as much as it affects the person who's being victimized. At least that's how I see it. So.
Well, all the way through, I felt so sorry for Bryan and his group of people. Every turn, you know, they just have to fight for every inch they get. Even though they prove things, the courts turn them down, they give them a hard time, you know. And as you get later in the book, even after the Supreme Court made some judgments, you still had trouble. Some of the states refused to pay attention to what the Supreme Court said.
And on top of it, he had to deal with death threats, bombing threats to the
Yes.
office. So he had personal threats on his own life while he's fighting for the life of these individuals. You know, I kept thinking, if he didn't have such credibility, it would be hard to believe that some of this was taking place in our country. It's, you know, it's so removed from anything I have experienced. It's just a real eye-opening book.
Well, another movie that captures some of that same feeling is Mississippi Burning. And that's also available. I believe it was on Netflix. I've more recently started watching things on Amazon Prime, but Mississippi Burning is historical as well and pretty frightening.
I'll go back to, and Deb, the few comments ago when you brought up chapter 12, the chapter about Martha Colby. It just struck me when I read that chapter because Martha Colby, that was Baldwin County, which is across the bay from Mobile. When we were going through the adoption process with James Henry, somehow in the conversation, our attorney that was working with us brought up Martha Colby. Martha Colby's story is still very well known in that area. And my attorney, our attorney who was representing our interests in the adoption, she was a very strong advocate for reform in that area. She's very conservative, very strongly against abortion, but she was one that put her money where her mouth was and stood up for families that had, all sorts of crises at home and tried to help them take care of, if they wanted to keep the baby, if they wanted to adopt out the baby, whatever they wanted to do. But that was a poster child in the Mobile area for not jumping to conclusions about things and reform for law that really changed a lot of people's minds, not necessarily who were for or against abortion, but just the idea that there is a whole shade of complexity that goes into the conversation about the issues of women's health, of reproductive rights, of the fact that legislation often tries to not only legislate the act, but the intent of the act. And it was just really fascinating reading that after having a little snippet of that from my time in Mobile, to really seeing how that story played itself out. It opened up a whole can of issues, one of which Tutwiler Prison, which I can tell you from the fact that Tutwiler would always appear on the 6 o'clock news in Mobile, it was still a hellhole. It's still a hellhole today, even though I would think it's better than what it was 30 years ago. But any other thoughts and reflections on that chapter in particular? Or if not, another topic of interest.
Well, I couldn't get my mic unmuted. Yeah, I kind of liked, overall in the book, we've kind of been looking at the justice system or injustice system in regards to people of color. But throughout the book, he's kind of sprinkled in these other subject areas: youth, the unfairness with youth, the mentally ill, the foster care system, and now, before the book is over, he talks about women who have met with injustice over having a stillborn baby and those various stories in there. So I kind of liked it that the book, that he brought in these other areas of where the justice system has not always been very fair.
I think the one thing he talks about a lot, or kind of comes at least towards the end of the book, and I assume also in one of these chapters, is the inequality of people who have money to get off, and those who do not have money cannot afford the lawyers, get very poor representation. They can't afford the repeal process. They basically have a whole different, outcome. And to a certain degree, this, because he represents, it's not completely a racial thing, although that does play a big part. It's more a matter of just the poor and the people that are the lower classes, or represent the people that are less fortunate. So the less fortunate basically tend to.
Well, and evidently, theoretically, if you don't have any money, the court is supposed to appoint a lawyer for you, but it doesn't sound like they always did, or if they did, it was just a matter of, somebody showing up to court and getting their $50 or whatever, and then saying, yeah, he's guilty, and that was the end of it. So the system certainly didn't work. It isn't like when you watch movies and some famous actor becomes the defense attorney.
And John Grisham writes the story. But it's well, the areas, the South, most of the South is very poor. And historically, it's very poor. So you have a lot of people that are so used, I wouldn't say they're so used to that, but the whites are poor, the blacks are poor, the children are poor. I mean, it's just, and I know it's a conundrum how the South could be so brilliant in so many respects, but then so stupid, resistant, and going constantly against their own interests on the other hand. And to me, I do not understand this. It's just something that will puzzle me to the day I die. And I doubt it will change very much. So.
Well, Deb, I think you're right. Not changing very much. Last week, I was having a conversation with a deacon who served as a chaplain in Angola, the Louisiana.
Oh.
And she served as a chaplain at the women's prison, and at one time was advised to back off because of threats on her life. And this is, today, in the last 10 years. And it distresses me that we're kind of looking at this and calling it ancient history, but it isn't. It's still pervasive.
Oh no, yeah, it's not ancient history.
No.
Well, there's sort of I think a feeling with a lot of people that they have somehow the divine right of retribution. I don't know how else to say that. In the South, it particularly, where my mother-in-law used to, had a good friend up on the Cumberland Plateau there in the rural area. And when she and my father-in-law retired up there, and they became part of what's called the Hephertsburg community. And they were, started this community center, but there was a lady who was also involved who was killed or injured in a car wreck, I think, and they took up a fund for her and gave it to the family. The son took the fund that was given for the woman's care and bought a pickup truck. And when people objected to this, he threatened to burn the community center down. And it's not like they could prosecute him or whatever, or they tried, but they couldn't get the money back. the woman had terrible problems, you know, paying her medical bills and her situation. But it was apparently just regarded as, well, he does that, or that's just how it goes. I mean, you know, it's just that still kind of sticks in my mind as an arson used to be a commonly accepted form of just, you know, you burn up somebody's house, you burn up the community center, you know, you still see a lot of that, but I'm not quite sure why that somehow stands out as a remarkable, sparkling thing to do to people you don't like or situations you don't care for. It's just burn them. And I wonder about that. But again, I think I started some of this discussion with the fact that I am of this culture. I come from here. I'm in here. I'm part of it. I'm inescapable from it, in spite of being raised Roman Catholic and all that stuff. I mean, I'm very much a hillbilly. So I'm still trying to figure this out and rectify the different parts of it. So anyway, just saying.
You know, I'm not defending the South, but the Vice Chancellor Sawana gave a talk recently on when did the South start. And one of the things he pointed out was that the South is the only part of the country, for a century at least, that lost a war.
Yes.
Number two, the economy was devastated. The value of the slaves economically was astonishing. It was a major part of our GNP at the time. And so it is true.
Yeah.
They had some problems.
But that's not completely why you have.
No, I'm not saying, but there is some reason.
That's an aspect of it. And I think a lot of the discussion on the Civil War and why the South somehow carries this chip on its shoulder about it, it's not entirely that. It's that people got clobbered, their food was stolen, people were burned, their kin was killed on both sides. The whole thing was just a terrible situation. And then they were conquered and things happened. It was just, you know, I had ancestors who fought on both sides. And this was very common. But what happened was, if the Union troops were in town, they arrested and or shot their relatives that they didn't care for very much, who were Confederates. And when the Confederates came into the area, they raised and took, you know, and shot. And there's a number of episodes very famous in Knoxville, including a doctor who was hung, you know, they strung him and threw him out the window, and various things that go on there. And this is like people that know each other, but they're on the opposite side. So this was used as an example of you know, a retribution that occurs and stuff like. It's just very sad business, but the war was just a very bad thing. So anyway.
Well, some of the repercussions.
You what?
I went to college at a small college in Pennsylvania, and I tend to think of Pennsylvania as being a fairly enlightened area, and I was struck by the note in the book about the fact that Pennsylvania, at least at the time the book was written, allowed children to be incarcerated for, I think I'm remembering correctly, for life. I think he said there were hundreds of children in Pennsylvania who were put away. Some of you may remember that more clearly than I do. It's been a little while since I read that chapter. But what struck me was these are not issues necessarily confined to the South.
Yeah.
And I was going to add a similar note about people out in the West. It's not as, you know, dramatic as some of these issues in the South. But if you look at the history of Portland, Oregon was anti-Black. I mean, legally anti-Black at a very early time. And that's what I was alluding to when I said there's a lot, I grew up in Spokane. There's a lot about my own region of the country that we never talked about. It was never in the newspapers. It's only now that I'm reading about this and finding out, you know, some of the grim past that's of the West, and we weren't part of the Civil War, but I can tell you that that feeling of white supremacy and blacks shouldn't own land and et cetera, that was imported apparently. You know, why did we end up with some of that? I have people in my extended family who did not hesitate to jump in their cars, find their shotguns, drive into Pullman, Washington, looking for blacks to shoot when there was an altercation between the, I think it was ATO house playing basketball with one of the dorms, and somebody using the N-word and blah, blah, blah. And then later a black came down and shot the front door of the ATO house. And you can bet the people in the countryside were packing, looking for blacks, you know, and the word went out real fast to stay inside. You know, there's some pretty horrible people out there looking for blood. And nobody had been killed when I mean, it's just the ATO door got shot, but there you go.
Oh, defend our doors.
I think we've seen since George Floyd died, Black Lives Matter marches in Japan and England and Paris and so forth. So although this book kind of points the finger at the South, and there are situations on the West Coast and up in the Northeast, this seems to be a universal problem of injustice for people of color.
A lot of it, I think it's got to be an education problem too. The South did, because of all the other economic problems they had, didn't have the money to support the schools. And the white people sent their kids to private schools. And so the poor whites and the blacks had to go, and everybody knows what kind of schools they ended up at. They weren't good. And they had poor materials and second-class buildings, and or maybe fourth-class buildings. You don't get much education that way. And many of those kids would not even probably go past 8th grade or so if they got that far, because they had to go to work. And so I think a lot of it, we've got an education problem in that people just don't learn a lot of things that they should learn.
A lot of wealthy people who went to good schools, and they're very racist. So you can't say it's just education. I mean, education is important, but if you have local leaders who don't believe, you know, in quote liberal unquote causes and don't want to change, they can be just as prejudiced and harmful because they are on the courts, they are the judges, they are the leaders.
Well, and they're just as uneducated about some things because of their white privilege. They don't know any black people. But some of these stories that have been in the paper this week have been quite fascinating. When people, you know, even when somebody has gone to college and so forth, they meet white people, they say, oh, you know that, or oh, you like music, or oh, can you afford that? You know, just like there's some other kind of creature.
Okay.
I think one of the great areas that we've touched on it here and there, but we really haven't brought it up as a specific topic of discussion, is the systemic issues of racism, socioeconomic injustice that are obviously pillars of this book. And it's been interesting, and I'm obviously not going to say who they are, but and the conversations have not been contentious. It's been sort of like what I said on Sunday. It's been let's have some disagreements on perspective and talk. But two people here at our parish have said, you know, we can talk about racism all we want, but you know, there's not a systemic problem. And my argument is strengthened about that there is every time I read some of this book, the issues of how people and a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about the judgment that was made about Walter's house, immediately even, you know, Bryan Stevenson kind of had this assessment, oh, this is a poor man's house. And obviously he knew Walter and didn't go any further with that, but we all make those kind of judgments. And the legal system, the justice system, is full of human beings who have these same ideas. And the story of Marcia Colby in chapter 12, and again, it's not, I keep coming back to that chapter just because it resonated on a lot of personal levels with me. But the fact that, oh, well, these are dirt poor, white trash people, and Martha's white, by the way, if you didn't pick up on that, white trash people that live out in trailers on the beach outside of Gulf Shores, and, you know, just having kids, and then a neighbor that on top of that happens to be real snooty and distrustful of them, and you know, says, okay, well, you know, she was pregnant, now she's not. Well, she must have done something to that baby because she's white trash. Same thing that we look at with Black people, Hispanic people, people who are different. And in many ways, too, as somebody has said, you know, that attitude is shifted back from for people who look at us from people of other cultures. But the simple fact of the matter is it's whoever's in power is the one in control of the justice system. And the story of Walter McMillan is just, you know, assumptions and prejudices and supposition and assumptions, all just this perfect storm of things that come together. And if it was one or two things isolated, you know, mistakes are made, although you could make I preface my own comment on that by saying one mistake in that regard is one too many. But I think it was in chapter 13, he gave the statement that there have been 50 exonerations from death row in the modern era since 1976. That's a significant percentage of exonerations, which, as you've seen from this book, to exonerate somebody who's been convicted of a crime, it's not an easy process. Imagine how many others might have been innocent who either did not have the representation or just gave up in the process and went ahead and they're executed, but were still innocent of the crime. So I think that, so I just throw that out because that's, as we get to next week will be our last week looking at the chapters in this book, and then we'll have one final week to sort of summate and talk about what have we learned and what can we do with this book as far as our ministry at St. Stephen's. But does anybody else want to touch explicitly on this issue of systemic racism, systemic injustice? As I know many have, but let's just, I think now it's time in our study that we kind of dive head on into this topic now that go ahead.
I think a lot of people misunderstand the word systemic.
Yes.
And I think that's where a lot of the problems come in. And I'm thinking of some of the police use of force, and the policemen then finally, in some cases, being suspended. But then you've got police unions who say by contract they have to be let back in. People are forgetting that unions are a system. It's an organization that has clout. And so that's an aspect of systemic, can be an aspect of systemic racism. I think, you know, it would be worthwhile to sit down and find a definition with examples of systemic. Because I have friends who say, no, it's not systemic. Well, it's because, number one, they haven't looked at it very closely or thought about all of, and I dare say until George Floyd, I didn't do as much reading as I've been doing now and watching the news and doing historical studies and movies of the times. So, my eyes have become more open to the various threads, as it were, throughout our culture that then could be systemic. But I think most people don't understand the word or see how that applies.
Well, I think the Black people see it. They had a service for the 85 people over in Scarborough, and they had it outside where the Scarborough School used to be, and before it was replaced. And they had the number of speakers, and the main speaker said, "Hey, folks, it ain't over." He made it very clear that it's still going on.
Well, I didn't mean to say the Blacks don't know, but the dominant folks, the white folks, are the ones who often deny this and don't see it. And that's part of it. They don't see. And I had posted a long thing in Facebook about all the things we don't see as whites. When we want to buy a house, nobody just turns around and says, "Oh, sorry, it's off the market." So we don't have the experiences that allow us to see the systemic roadblocks to what we want to do.
Well, I'll go out on a limb. I can walk through Kroger or Walmart or Walgreens, and I will pass a person of color, and they will not make eye contact with me. And that tells me, or it reinforces a lot of things that I've read these 50 years since I graduated from college, of when it was against the law or the norms for a Black person to look into the eyes of a white. But what that tells me is that our society is failing our African American brothers and sisters, and now people of color that are migrating to the U.S. from Mexico and South America, that the system of education in our society continues to kind of force them into being suppressed, if that's the right word to use. So I know that I'm not sure what we would define systemic racism as, but I think society in general, the education system and our norms, our society norms have kind of are continue to kind of try to keep people of color suppressed. Sorry.
I feel it's a very healthy thing for us to be aware of that, though. And to try to address it. I think that's one thing that makes us unique as a country. I see articles, I follow a lot of the BBC news, and if there's a big headline about like Black Lives Matter, then there was like a great article on the BBC website about the legacy of our racism and how that affected America. And then there's discussions again as we saw in France and other places about Black Lives Matter. And I just think that we're so interconnected as a world that perhaps we are, as a whole planet, moving maybe to at least acknowledge or get a little bit beyond that. And I tend to think that that's a very hopeful thing. At least that's my feeling about it, because I see a lot of other countries examining themselves and their own particular traditions in this way. So anyway, just wanted to go rah, rah for that.
If you want to see a sign of progress, I saw it this week. Bailey knows about it. I went to Sewanee. And in 1950, when I was there, the whole seminary faculty resigned because the university refused to integrate.
Yeah. Oh, I
This,
didn't know that.
this spring, Sewanee elected a Black president, vice chancellor. And this week we got an email in which the Board of Regents formally abrogated Sewanee's history.
Yeah.
Sewanee's history was that they were started to teach the true version, biblical version of slavery.
Yeah,
And if you don't think this is a change,
it is. But that's good. I think it's good. Even if a
Well,
lot of
it's-
people don't like it, but
it's not only good, it's amazing.
yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Some of you may have seen the CNN article this past week that the city of Monroeville, where this story takes place, this week elected a Black mayor.
Oh, wow, that's cool. Yeah.
First one. So yeah, there is change.
And we may have a,
That's one social progress that may have been helped by legislation, because a lot of the changes because of the voter changes. And
we have a Black female a Democratic candidate running for Senate here in Tennessee, and I'm not sure what kind of chance she stands, but it's real good to see her run and campaign. That's a first. It's just really good. And
Equality, she has the same chance that a white Democrat running for Senate would have in Tennessee.
what's amazing about that, she spent $15,000 on her campaign. Wow. Against a heavily funded lawyer from Nashville. And
well, she's from Memphis.
I know her campaign spent $15,000.
Well,
And the lawyer from Nashville was heavily funded.
oh yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
But it'd be great to see her. Unfortunately, I think they tend to write off the upper East Tennessee area.
Oh, I'm afraid the Democrats are hopeless in Tennessee.
Well, yeah, it's just, as one Nashville person told me, it's like they don't even recognize that East Tennessee is a different time zone. It's just Nashville, Memphis, East Tennessee. So anyway, that's how it is. Anyway, I'd love to get her here for an event. So it'd be cool. Great. She's done a number of things in Chattanooga, and then she's done a Zoom thing in Knoxville, but I don't really know if she's done much in the other counties. So we'll see. Things happen.
I think I'm often surprised to discover some of the stereotypes that I have and the prejudgments that I have based on previous experience or just making assumptions about people. And I suspect I'm not alone in that. And I think part of the challenge is to simply be aware, each of us, of the judgments that we make, the assumptions we make about others. That's where we start. That's where we start breaking down our own personal rush to judgment about other people.
Yeah. Yeah, I've read several stories lately about Black people going into a store and being followed.
Yeah.
Immediate judgment is, even if the Black person is dressed well and so forth, And even if they're with a white person, they still will follow them around in the store. They don't follow the white people, they follow the black people around. They may follow some white people around, you know, white kids that look like punks. But basically, there's an unwritten rule in small stores, you follow the black people around.
One of the things that I found interesting about the Oak Ridge Solutions on Racism, Pastor Derek Hammond leads it, and I've gone a couple of times, but I'm not really an active part of that group, but I put together a news article for them. Pastor Hammond has been trained at the Kettering Foundation in Dayton, Ohio, in what would be called the democratic, small d, democratic process of active dialogue and then framing in order to find just those areas that people make assumptions in and how those assumptions bear on the decisions they make. And of course, the group is applying this to their own and sense of racism, and they're blacks and whites in that group, and I'd say both groups find they make judgments about the other based on framing and things they bring with them from their own biases that they didn't even know about. I mean, these are people who are well-meaning and maybe consider themselves well-adjusted, and yet, you know, they find through the dialogue process, wait, there are some things that I didn't even know were part of my background. So if people who are sensitive can be finding these things, well, you can imagine I'd say I don't know what proportion of the United States is introspective, but I would suspect it's not a very large percentage. And so, you know, I think a lot of people have these biases and whatnot, whether they know it or not, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Many of you know I worked at Aid to Distressed Families for 30 years and interviewed a lot of people. And one of the things that I became aware of was all too often a rush to judgment on my part. I would walk in the waiting room to get the client that was waiting for me, and I might see somebody who's covered with tattoos and body piercings. And it was really hard to keep an open mind. And often I was very surprised. Many times we were very bright people, well-read. And one of the things I learned over and over again was not to jump to conclusions, to try to see that person as unique and what they had to offer. But I became very aware of biases I didn't know I had, you know, just almost on a daily basis. You know, it was a lot of a kind of self-examination to try to keep that open mind.
I would find that when I was doing CASA work and I would go out to interview people in their homes and find myself making judgments based on differences in socioeconomics between myself and them, or education, all sorts of things, and find that as you persisted in talking to these people over a period of months, my outlook would change. But yeah, that rush to judgment is there.
I think an example for each of us is an experience I had some months ago. I was at a traffic light and a vehicle pulled up next to me. Just imagine yourself in this position. Late model car, really slick looking, low rider, low wheels, real close to the ground, completely blackened windows. And just immediately, who is the driver? Just think about it in your mind. What was the driver? Male or female? Young or old? Black or white? I know what judgment I made immediately.
Did you ever find out what the driver was?
A 73-year-old nun. No. No, I'm sorry. No, I did not know.
Low rider. Yeah, I'm thinking of that song, Low Rider. That's.
It's funny you say that, Steve. In Mobile, I was at a stoplight. A woman pulled up next to me, blaring out AC/DC at full blast out of her speakers, and I looked over, and it's a woman that had to be in her mid-70s or up who was doing that, and she was wearing a hat like she'd go to church and blaring out AC/DC. So I mean, it doesn't matter whatever it is, just the expectations and stereotypes are just. That one was funny, but it made me realize that what kind of judgments do I make about people, and that might lead to some sort of problem on my part, and that could cause me to act with assumptions towards someone because of that very expectation. So, folks, we're getting close to bring up another subject tonight. I do want to get into a little bit of chapter 13 next time, because what that chapter dealt with was, Walter's released, but the trauma of going through what he did, and the trauma of of the alienation that comes from not just the broken system in his regard, but just from the ways in which numerous people and groups within our society feel that they're ostracized and put down, dehumanized for whatever reason and in whatever way. And so I do want to jump into a little bit of that for next time. But for our read for next week, let's do 14, 15, 16 and the epilogue. I know that's a lot to read. That finishes the book. We'll cover that material. And then our last meeting of this group will be 2 weeks from today on the 23rd. And that, I hope y'all can plan on being at that. And I'll try to make sure everybody else who's been part of the group off and on can come to that, because that really is, to me, okay, so what do we do now with this? We've had this nice discussion, but the things we brought up, the things we've talked about, I want those things to get integrated into the way in which we do our ministry with each other and with the wider community. And what can we learn, particularly on the issues of racism and socioeconomic, especially since we're very active in the community already with folks who are African American, with folks who are from very, very rural Appalachia parts who might be 20 miles from us, but might as well live 1,000 miles from us as far as their way of life and their perspective on things. So that's our homework for next time. Any final thoughts from anybody before we conclude? Joe, we didn't get to my sermon. You wanted to do that. Maybe if you want to bring that up next time, you can do that. So, but I appreciate everybody being here. Thank you again, and look forward to seeing you next week at 6:30.